We're here today to talk about what's next in standards and standards publishing. To begin, I'd like to give a very brief historical context of publishing at ISO and IEC. In 1906, IEC was founded, and in 1947, ISO was founded. Both organizations started publishing on paper, obviously. In the 1980s, with the advent of email, internet, HTML, business practice started entering the digital age. The 1990s saw the invention of the PDF and of XML. And in the 1990s and 2000s, PDFs were integrated into IEC and ISO's tool chains as part of publishing. In 2008, ISO-CS was mandated to provide XML versions of standards, and IEC started doing this in 2015. In 2018, IEC formed a strategic group on digital transformation, otherwise known as SG12. And in 2019, ISO had a strategic advisory group on machine-readable standards, otherwise known as SAG-MRS. And in 2020, both organizations are working on the online standards development program. And we'll go into more detail on that later. Both organizations have been collaboratively working on using the same XML schema for the XML provided by both organizations. IEC and ISO are now using ISO STS, as are Sentinelec and various members. ISO STS is a document-centric schema that allows for semantic enrichment, and we hope that this will prove useful as we develop standards formats and the granularity of our standards in future. ISO and IEC published the ISO STS XML coding guidelines earlier this year, and ISO STS is the schema used in the online standards development program.
The Online Standards Development Program is another very important collaboration between IEC and ISO, which will eventually include the participation from tens of thousands of experts worldwide who today produce standards for IEC, for ISO, and will in the future be using an online standards development tool, at the heart of which is the editor that Fonto has come up with, and Fonto is also represented in this symposium, so they will talk more about their product at a later point. The Fonto editor is an XML-based tool that we are now integrating into our standards development process for drafting standards. The great thing about it is that we can completely configure it to our own needs, which means we can implement the rules of IEC and of ISO standards development into the tool, and thereby supporting experts in the whole workflow of drafting a standard. And there are lots of pain points that we're addressing with this. I can't go into detail on them right now because that would just take too long, but we're really trying to facilitate the work of our experts who give their free time to work on standards that we then publish. And we're also trying to improve the situation for our members, the national committees, in that we offer a way of facilitated commenting that is required at the voting stages. So for each standard that is published, we have various stages where the standard needs to be voted on and where comments need to be made by our national representatives. And that's something we want to facilitate by offering an online platform of doing that. So generally, I think we can say that we're trying to move to the future of standards development by making contents more granular, more modular. Another approach in this context was undertaken by IEC about 15 years ago, when we created a web application to allow the online creation and the lifecycle management of structured content, which is basically based on databases. So we have a database that contains the content in a very structured modular way. And on top of that, we have a workflow management system that allows us to create content, validate content in very small pieces. For example, Some standards and database format that we've mentioned here are the IEV for terminology, some standards containing graphical symbols, or component data dictionary, which is all a collection of individual pieces of content, such as graphical symbols with their description, that can, thanks to the standards and in database format application, can be managed piece by piece. So you can create one graphical symbol, you can send it through its entire life cycle, you can update it whenever needed, thus always having the most current content online for consultation by the user, allowing easy navigation for users, advanced search functionalities, and all of the advantages that come with more modular and more granular contents. And we currently have a project going on that will allow us to put the whole web application on new feet and make it more modern, look at the new technical possibilities we have to create new benefits for standards creators and standards users.
In terms of digitalization and practice, it's fairly clear that the world is moving towards more digital-centric business practices, and publishing is no different. We will see this affect standards development, distribution, and use. And it's also fairly clear that certain industries are more data-centric than others and require standards in formats that go beyond PDF, which isn't to say that PDF would ever die out, but it's clear that users need more than that. So there are new possibilities for products and services in the standards development realm. And the focus seems to be on machine readability or interoperability. To that end, the ISO Strategic Advisory Group on Machine Readable Standards released a report in 2020 to ISO's governance. This report identified that there is a user and market need for data-centric standards, and that this is particularly relevant for certain technical industries such as energy and technology and construction and so on. This concept of machine readability would affect standards development right from drafting through to distribution. And the report coined a phrase to describe the concept and formats that would fall under machine readable standards. ISO Smart, a standard that is machine applicable, readable, and transferable. And the report also discovered, the group also discovered that many technical committees are already working on products, methodologies, and data sets. And it's really key that standards development bodies provide these formats as well as the demand is there. In terms of machine readability, we could also say interoperability, transferability. There isn't really a good global consensus on a definition of machine readability, but industry-specific ones exist, and they all talk about this interaction between data, human, and machine. In the past, it's been clear that humans have needed to translate data into a machine-readable format. A machine-readable standard would perhaps take the human out of the equation, allowing the data in the standard to be directly used and processed by a machine. But that isn't to say that a machine-readable standard is not also human-readable. The concept takes in a lot of considerations. There are various stakeholders, cybersecurity, lots of potential formats, infrastructure considerations to take into account, distribution and commercial viability, and so on. What is clear is that in terms of standards development, users and industry practice must guide decision making. And as multiple organizations and groups are already working on this topic and on products, it's clear that we as standards organizations have to do more work on this as well. I am sharing a graph here that's been shared at least at the international level. I like this graph as it shows the concept in a graphic way about what machine readability could look like in terms of formats. This is a classification scheme devised of levels, and it shows how machine readable really requires lots of granularity in terms of data.
All of these initiatives open up new possibilities for standards development organizations and also for supporting our users in the consultation of our standards. For us as standards publishers, it will become increasingly easy to create new output, new formats for our publications. For instance, an increased use of commented red lines where we show, okay, these are the contents that have changed from the last edition to this one. And these are the reasons why. We can now track all of the comments that went into the elaboration of a standard and use them at the publication stage. We can publish to multiple formats, multiple platforms based on the source XML that can be rendered in various different ways. We can also take the XML because of the semantic categories and also the modular categories of the standards and database format, for instance, and extract different categories for different needs. For instance, we can extract the terminology in a certain series of standards for use by end users, or we could imagine showing the relationships between standards, because every standard has in its normative reference section or its bibliography section dynamic links to the other standards that need to be consulted in order to correctly interpret that standards. We can graphically illustrate the relationships between standards. And we can make use of all the dynamic cross-references that can now be inserted into our standards and the multiple possibilities of providing contextual information to really make it easy for standards users to interpret the information correctly. So to conclude, there are important initiatives going on at IEC and ISO. Very importantly, the collaborative authoring, an XML-first approach, which will allow us to create lots of new products and services. And of course, the machine-readable standards initiative, smart standards initiative, where we'll be able to get to quite a high level of machine interpretability and exchanging data from our standards with machines that can then just ingest the contents in an automated way. And finally, we'll continue to work together, and thus with all the benefits that entails for our common members and of course of the synergies that are inherent in working together, we'll continue to collaborate on the implementation and further harmonization of the use of our XML schema and ISO STS between IEC and ISO.